Hey everyone, what's going on? This is Lee here with Jason. Jason, what's new, man?
Not much. End of the school year, transition phase. Looking forward to an amazing summer. I hope everyone else out there in YouTube land is as well.
Awesome. And always my favorite thing when we get on here is I get to see weightlifting equipment behind you all the time. It just gets me in the mood for for performance. That's a great background right there.
Well, I
So,
equally was energized and excited to see the kettlebell snatches on your Facebook posts with some of
oh,
your videos. That is literally one of my favorite
I love
exercises
those.
of all time with kettlebells. So fun and so scalable. Like, have you ever seen the ones where you do alternating?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
used to do those with 52s when I was back in my 30s doing mixed martial arts, and I could crush those for like 3 minutes straight, but I'd hurt my back if I even tried it for 20s right now. So
Well, you know what's great about them too is um, coaches will say, well, I don't have the space to do Olympic lifting. I'm like, you got dumbbells, you got kettlebells. All you need is the frame of your athlete, because that dumbbell stays right in their frame. You
yeah,
can have somebody 4 feet over and
yep.
not have any issues with space. So there's no excuse not to do variation of those. So
Well, the snatch, you could do that in an elevator, like shoulder to shoulder or nose to back with someone, because it's going straight up the slide, right?
exactly. So, hey guys, really excited today. Jason and I have been talking about this a lot. So, there's been some pretty heavy information here for coaches and parents and whomever, is absorbing this to really start to understand the psychology of what we're talking about, what can happen. So today, I wanted to get in Jason's brain a little bit here and have him share some of the strategies that he does with his groups, with his teams, with maybe adult groups or organizations to kind of give us as coaches ideas how we can start to implement things to improve our physical performance, because the physical will come from the mental a lot, but obviously the mental thought process. So, in this double dribble kids, again, we're trying to help kids, obviously, but we want to bring this to families and the communities so that we start to get a culture that's really powerful. So, Jason, I'm going to get out of your way, and I want you to dive into, I just recently, I don't know if you know this, but I just recently got named boys head basketball coach here where I live. And part of the reason I wanted to get involved was because I want to help change the culture. It's a program that's struggling a little bit. I don't think has a real great culture right now. Maybe not anyone's fault, but it just wasn't addressed. Like, hopefully you're going to talk about this a little bit, is you got to work at culture. You can't just say to the team, hey, I want a better culture. Go, right? It doesn't work that way. You got to do things. So I'm going to get out of your way. What are some things that we might be able to do to start this process?
Oh man, this is such an awesome topic. I believe culture is everything. And in the last 2 years, I have just been swimming in the deep end of this topic. I will reference one of the greatest resources on this that I've come across is Daniel Coyles' book, Culture Code. And I'm going to talk about 3 elements that he brings up. And if you were to Google search it and look for the hack, so you don't necessarily have to download or read the book, the 3 things in the culture code that Daniel Coyle points out. Number 1, it is psychological safety. And that happens through belonging cues. So are your daily experiences with athletes in your program from top to bottom, not just the level that you coach, but if you're the varsity coach, is the modified experience, which is one of the greatest athletic directors in Section 2 recently said to me, he said, those are our gatekeepers, our modified coaches. And where he says, as an AD, I cringe every time I check for a pulse and say, yep, you can be our modified coach because you have a pulse, because they're so few and far between to find. And he's like, that's our gatekeeper. And we're just happy that they have a pulse. So that really contradicts in some ways. This person at that level and all levels needs to make sure there's belonging cues being sent on a regular daily, basis. And Daniel Coyle calls that the psychological safety. And safety is a dangerous word because, right now there's these beliefs about generations, and the safest a kid can feel is probably holding this device in their hand because it becomes a coping mechanism. And you know what, it's not their fault. So you can just plan for that to be kind of an element of their condition currently. But going back to Daniel Coyle, psychological safety through belonging cues. So I'll just cut to it. Belonging cues, must have them. Number two is shared vulnerability. And vulnerability is such a popular topic in all spaces currently in high performance. Brene Brown is probably the front thought leader on that topic. But I always laugh because I see, over the shoulder on the bookcase, on the bookshelf, Brene Brown's work, but then I see people with a gross lack of willingness to be vulnerable. I painted my nails. It's coming off, but I painted my nails the last couple of weeks of school because there were some kids getting picked on for painting theirs. So I modeled vulnerability and I showed up with my nails painted. I didn't even talk to the kids who were, marginalizing the individuals who were doing that. But you have to be willing to be vulnerable. And when you have a group of people that can share moments of vulnerability, that kind of extinguishes the gross fear of failure that can infect a culture. And it extinguishes some of the jealousy or envy that can infect a culture. So back to belonging cues, shared vulnerability. And then number three is a common story. You don't have to be around me too long to see some of the subliminal messages that I send to my students and my athletes. One of my favorite stories was at the end of my coaching career when I probably hit full stride in my effectiveness. And I always said I was in New York, we have a teacher assessment program where teachers are evaluated, and the highest score you can get, highest rating, is highly effective. And I always would say, I tell my administrators or my AD, I don't want to be highly effective. I want to be highly affective. And it was all about kind of teaching to the heart and connecting with kids. But my wrestling team, right before the end of the season, because my nails were painted all the time at that time, largely a part of the program that I used to facilitate, and around empathy and bullying. And anyway, my team, I was modeling vulnerability and modeling some of these messages. And, each finger had a lesson, red thumb reminder, the golden rule. We had all these little things. And my team painted their nails before the Section 2 tournament. The biggest tournament of the year, my guys painted their nails. And that sounds so weird. But again, you got to remember, these are high school teenage boys that I was influencing with a culture of guys that were very successful. I had some tough, aggressive, I would even say violent within the rules of wrestling guys on my team. They'd go out and pick guys up and drop them on their head, but then they would help them up and then run over, shake their coach's hand. So the idea in that one is really this concept of like a common story. Like, we'll kick your what, but we'll also help you up and hug your grandmother. So it's a common story. It's a mantra. It's a message. It's a mission statement, right? So many people don't know their core values and mission of their group, of their program. And I know a lot of coaches and talk family, but do they model family? And what's modeling family look like? I can tell you what it doesn't look like. It doesn't look like something out of the 1980s when a kid walks in the gym a minute late and everybody on the line and they do sprints. Right. That's not a very good way to model family. It's kind of abusive. And that's kind of how we were coached, right? And I practice some of those, but it's breaking down culture. In that moment, I truly believe, well, how do you hold them accountable? I think there's a dozen better ways to hold somebody accountable for walking in a minute late, especially if maybe their reason made sense.
Yeah, give us an example. Give us like one or two examples of something that does make sense, because I'm with you on that. And early on, I came out of college, tough college coaches. So when I was 23 and a head coach, I did some of that stuff as well. And then as it went on, my personality came through as like, well, that just doesn't feel good to me as a person, let alone a coach. So I would kind of just have a conversation with them and say, I get it, you're late, but we can't do that. But give us an example of what you're talking about.
Well, I think the example really, all of the best practices that exist right now in education, and we're talking athletics, and we're talking school age kids, whether you're talking youth to varsity, and even at the collegiate level. I'm working with Castleton College right now, and some of the stories that I could tell about ninth graders really could apply to a senior in college. And I think that every example would probably go would connect to their story. Every kid has a story, how they were raised, what their current status is in their home environment, their home situation. So a kid who is missing a sneaker, who is scrambling in the locker room, and he shows up with 2 different sneakers on because he was able to find another one, that kid probably had something last night that kept him from organizing his sneakers and being ready to show up at practice prepared. And that last night thing might not have been a last night. It might have been an ongoing last several months. I know some of the highest performers that I have. I just went, I know I got to be careful how I say the things, because if somebody watches this, I don't want them to I got to, privacy is important. But one of the highest performers that I know is dealing with some major challenges in their household that are very secretive. And we look at these high performers and we expect greatness because that's what they exude. But we have no idea what their bedroom situation is, what their parenting situation is. I'm not giving kids excuses or free passes. I'm saying there's a better way. So everything in education right now is really a heightened awareness, a heightened consciousness of the potential trauma that's going on, the potential crises that are going on in their home. How do I de-escalate them? And, I always ask this question when I was working in professional development with educators, is teaching an art or a science? And I could even take coaching to a higher level, because I think the best teachers are actually coaches. Mm-hmm. And I would say, is coaching an art or a science? And the answer is it's both. You have to be super artistic and you have to respect the science of this experience as well. So, other examples, maybe the kid was in the hallway meeting with another kid who was in crisis. Maybe the kid remembered something at the last minute and had to run and talk to a teacher because they want so badly to improve their grade because they know you're on their ass. And I would say probably not all the time, but 80%, sometimes more, it usually is something that makes sense to the kid's brain. It was poor planning on their part. Rarely is it a gross, like they were hiding in the locker room, sure. They were eating chocolate bars, they were kissing their girlfriend for 10 minutes. And like, why does a kid kiss his girlfriend for 10 minutes? Probably because something at home, they're not getting the psychological safety at home. It's, they go through the course of the school day. Now there's a window before practice starts. And if that window bleeds into 3:04 and they walk in and everybody else is doing what they're supposed to, and this kid shows up at 3:04, there's probably a reason they were lingering, so you got to get to the bottom of that story. And then once you can hammer the kid, right? Like that's, yep. Once you have a deep connection with the kid, there's things that I can get away with saying to some of my most connected kids, and they appreciate that it's a relationship that goes beyond teacher coach, okay. So hopefully that makes sense. But to go back to Daniel Coyles, a rich culture has those 3 elements. It has belonging cues, it has shared vulnerability, and a common story. Those core values and those missions that we need to make sure are identifiable.
I love that, really do. Give us an example of belonging cues. Like, what is something you would say to maybe your classroom or your athletes, or maybe you have a training group, like a sports performance group? What is belonging cues?
I think it's just the idea, like I just did a post on Instagram because we're coming down to the end of the year here, and I have a free hugs poster. We stood in front of the school right after that Texas massacre. Yeah. Free hugs, right? I think I had that hanging over my shoulder on one of our other calls. Yes. And that's vulnerability to stand up with that and ask somebody to hug you, essentially, right? Subliminally. Yeah. But like the belonging cue that I used on Instagram recently is I put that free hug poster above a 100-pound dumbbell. I said, this picture sums up my weight room as a whole. Lift heavy and be nice. And everybody can expect that. And some really amazing interactions happen through the course of the school year, some of the, and we know that you remember the movie The Breakfast Club, right? And
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
stereotypes of kids, right? So there's the social emotional kids or emo type kids. There's the, jocks, there's the nerds, there's the socially awkward, there's all these different types, right? So I got to be careful because I don't believe or think that way. I think all kids, I call every kid an athlete, whether they choose to compete or not.
Me too. Me too.
So, but my point is, you can look at a kid and be like, that kid's athletic. You can look at a kid and say, that kid's got 2 left feet. You can look at a kid and say, oh, they're a brainiac. And you can look at a kid and say, oh, they have some stuff going on at home because they, the way they're dressed or their hair. So, but those kids in my weight room come together. They spot each other, they partner each other, they encourage each other, they make friendships in here. And then when you go into the cafeteria where there's no psychological safety, where there's no shared vulnerability, where there isn't like a common story of a weight room experience where we're all here for the same reason, then they all go back to their comfort zones of, I sit with the jocks, I sit with the nerds, I sit with the less popular, you're more popular. And they're kind of survival of the fittest there. I remove all that in this space because the belonging cue is just knowing their name, giving them feedback, asking them, if it's a kid who seems lazy, have a conversation with them and get to know their story a little bit. And then I actually lift with them. Hey, do you want to do a couple sets with me? I'll show you how to do this. Why don't you come over? Because I need a little motivation on some of these skull crushers, and maybe you'll like this exercise because it'll give you big triceps. So, the conversation, there's an amazing guy out in the Midwest. He had a school district, and again, I'm going to make this quick, but it's really relevant. This guy is like a genius wizard. His accolades are like second to none. This was a Native American reservation school district. Mm-hmm. He was a guidance counselor in this school district, and it was like over the course of 2 years, they experienced 13 suicides. So if you just take the 24 months and you say, okay, 13 suicides in 24 months, how do you fit that in without like utter, like just shock and chaos and destruction, right? And one of them was it happened on school grounds. So this guy got involved intensely, was a little critical of the way that it was being addressed. They said, you're in charge, essentially. And he became kind of the point person and developed programming, developed systems, developed processes, and implemented them. And for the next 2 years, they only experienced one. So that is a really, one is too many, but that is a gross, like something major happened. And I had the chance to interview this guy and have some long conversations and share perspectives. This was about 5 years ago. I had this conversation with him. I said, what's the secret? I said, give me 1 or 2 nuggets. Tell me the secret. What did you do? What was it specifically? Like, I know all this stuff you're talking about, but give me the thing. He said, conversations.
Yeah.
I said,
makes
really?
So much sense. Yeah.
Conversations. Now, if you think about how we interact on a daily basis, I'm a dad. I have 2 kids, a 15 and a 17. I don't know if I had a conversation with my kids yesterday. I interacted with them. Mm-hmm. I told them things. We were together. Did I have a conversation? What is a conversation, right? Yeah. And are we having conversations with our athletes? Are our athletes having conversations with us, with each other? And that's the value bomb I want to drop in a second, but I don't want to do it until you comment on anything that I just said.
I think that is so critical because it's really important. One thing that I've always tried to say to my team. So I'm always listening, like during our prep period or warm up, or if we're in the weight room or whatever. I listen to how the kids talk amongst each other. And the one thing I'm always trying to preach to them, I'm like, stop talking at your teammates. Talk with them, talk to them, but don't talk at them. And talking at them, for those who don't know, is kind of like, I'm just telling them what to do. I'm telling them my thought only, and for being very aggressive and not being engaging and accepting of their conversation back to me or talking. It's kind of like, and I remember hearing this a long time from an older coach. He had said, and this was back a long time ago when it was pretty much gruff and hard-nosed. And he would say, he said, stop talking at your teammates, talk to them. And it always stuck with me. So yeah, I love where you're going with this.
So this value bomb that I wanted to drop, I call them culture circles. Now I'm doing this currently with Castleton University Wrestling. They've only been in existence, I believe, 6 seasons total. I can never remember whether it's 6 or 5. That first year was it seems like forever ago. But anyway, I've been working with them consistently for 3 years in a row. The coach there was an iconic Vermont State coach, Coach Mount Anthony Wrestling. His name's Scott Legacy, and he was nationally recognized multiple times for High School Coach of the Year because of his program at Mount Anthony. And he took over this Division III program. Now they were in the top 20 this year. They've beaten some top 10 teams and are neck and neck. Next year, I think they're going to crack the top 10. And that's pretty impressive considering it's a brand new program, essentially, in a climate where wrestling is dying in some parts of the country, right? So we started doing these culture circles, man, and Coach Legacy is one of the best coaches on the planet, highly respected nationally. And he said, this is some of the best work I've ever done in the sport of wrestling. And had nothing to do with wrestling, everything to do with conversations, everything to do with humanizing the experience of their program. And when so here's an example of like a open-ended icebreaker type, just get the dialogue going. And we would open up with, if you could go anywhere in time, in a time machine, and bring someone with you, who would you go with and why? The answers just blow your mind. You find out that this kid's mother died. You find out that this kid has been raised in foster care since he was 3. Mm-hmm. You find out that this kid's grandfather died last week. You find out that they want to go into the future because they're visionaries. So if I want to go into the future, that might make me one heck of a candidate to be looking at becoming a national champion over the next 3 years. So there's so much that you can take away from that when you're in these culture circles situation. And then you could drop in questions once you get used to it. Maybe the first 2 weeks, especially with a high school group, you stay in that space and you kind of play around with these questions that are, if you had $1 million, how would you spend it? And you learn about each other, and then this is one of my favorite ones I did with the varsity lacrosse team. They're having a lot of penalties and swearing and embarrassing bench moments when someone would come out of the game. And they were really struggling with leadership, and they had some really top-notch kids. And this is another pet peeve of mine. We don't do anything to develop leadership, but culture circles develops opportunities to have the conversation, to role play the conversation. Here's a question. What would you say if one of your teammates throws their helmet, drops an F-bomb, and is, behind the bench embarrassing our team? How do you get that person back on the rails? Go. And now each person shares their perspective on how they would do that. I think that's going to have a lasting impact on the next time someone's going to come off the field and throw their helmet and drop an F-bomb. So we're training them to kind of see the future, see their future self responding to it. And it's making our captains better. It's making our youngest, least experienced players better. We're building a culture of understanding, building that common story, sharing that vulnerability. Because if I say, you know what, I actually told you to get your head out of your, and quit being whatever, that wasn't my best self as a leader. I'm sharing that vulnerable moment because I'm owning my own mistake, right? So are there belonging cues? Yeah. Why? Because everyone in that circle is getting a chance to share their perspective. Is there psychological safety in that? Of course there is. Do I feel heard at the end of the practice when I go home? How many weeks or months go by when some of your veteran players don't ever get to share their perspective? Some kids will go a whole season and never say, I just don't feel like I'm in the best shape I could be. We need to push ourselves harder, guys. Those moments are never provided. And then we drive home disgruntled. These lazy sons of guns don't know how to push themselves, and nobody has the eye of the tiger anymore. And we're disgruntled, but we never addressed it in an appropriate way that would provide those 3 things and build that common story, build that culture.
I love that. I really do, because I think that is one thing that we tried to do a lot with any of my programs. And I try to get my assistants and my modified coaches and all to understand the same thing about making sure that your players have the opportunity to share their thoughts, because you'll be amazed at how intelligent they are, and that they're not just kind of skating through a practice. Often, sometimes if they are, usually, like you mentioned at the very beginning, there's a reason. This is the least important thing to them in their day because they just had an awful night at home with their stepdad or their mom or something. So, how do I run an out of bounds play isn't the most important thing in their life right now. But allowing them to have that opportunity to share what they're seeing and what they're feeling and what's possible. And hey, coach, I really think I'm best if I do this. I'm like, well, great. I'm glad you brought that, because I want to know why you feel that way, because you've kind of held back. And they said, well, you didn't ask me to do it. I'm like, well, now you got permission to ask that stuff. You know what I mean? So I think that's really important. So I want to ask you this, because I know, we don't want to go too long for the listeners. We try to keep it, but this topic could go forever. I love this. New coach, or in my case, I've been coaching a long time, but a new position, new school, day one, meeting my team. What are some things that gently introduce this type of culture?
Yeah.
Whether it's a cultural circle right off and just saying, hey, this is where I've been. Where have you guys been in your life? Any different states, or have you traveled? Where would I start?
Yeah, we could definitely do a whole nother call on just the culture circle process.
Yeah.
And I always give my resources, but I will say that my style of culture circle has been morphed. So go back to best practices in schools. Restorative justice is a very popular, practice that's going on in schools. There's also culture, sharing circles or community circles, a restorative circle. And it works really well because if you establish, and this is really the way that it should be done, but schools get this wrong all the time. We should have sharing circles where we have those conversations about what we do if you had $1 million, or where you'd go and who you'd take with you if you could have lunch anywhere on the planet. Once that process is built, and there's really some very detailed approaches to that are pretty important, like guidelines. We all have to agree to this, only one person's allowed to talk at a time. There's actually a talking piece, because this goes all the way back to tribal times. Yeah. And here's the problem with our youth, and we just came off of this call. This really screws up the caveman brain. And no matter how evolved we become and how much technology we introduce, we do have cave people brains, and we need belonging cues. We need psychological safety in order to stay out of fight, flight, freeze. So the fight, flight, freeze is a caveman response to live, right? So kids are in survival states, and we need to calm them down and bring them into the tribal state so that they can be part of a community, right? And have that common story and that shared vulnerability and be in a healthy culture. So, and this is the work that we're doing with companies. I mean, I'm on a regular basis having these conversations with businesses in the consulting work that I get to do.
That's so important.
So, going back to it though, every kid has a desire to achieve. They all have a drive to want to hit home runs, to want to be record holders, but then they get punched right in the face with the reality of what it takes. And if you are the one punching them, figuratively with the zero tolerance structure, the high standard for accountability, the sometimes age inappropriate practices, the lack of an art or science approach, then, I question how much more could we have gotten out of that kid with a better approach where you can take a stray dog and actually turn them into an attack dog through the processes. And if you look at canine care and canine training, you don't kick a dog to make him do what you want him to do. You don't scold the dog to get it to do what you want to do. You reinforce behaviors. And while the dog's not being held accountable, you should rub its nose in the urine. The dog has no idea why you're rubbing its nose in the urine. It just knows you've got it by the neck and you're making it do something it doesn't want to do. Now it's afraid of you. People don't quit their jobs. They quit their bosses. Kids don't quit sports. They quit their coaches.
Exactly.
And that's a lot of pressure to put on ourselves. Brett Bartholomew has a great book about conscious coaching.
Yep.
We all have to be better conscious coaches. And this is what we're doing. We're raising consciousness. But I think if we get back and, so the first thing that you do, like if you and I did a rock, paper, scissors activity, fan club, very popular, Google it, you'll find it. It's a great group dynamic. You and I play. If I win, you become my biggest fan. And it comes down.
I just did this with I don't mean I just did this a week ago. I did a combine for anybody that wanted to do it in the rec league, and we had a bunch of kids, and that was one of our activities.
Well, so everybody's smiling. It's a different experience, but it also, there's a circuit in my brain. If you beat me, I hate you, right? Like as a wrestler, and I don't really hate you, that's a strong word, but the truth of it is, if you beat me, that pisses me off. I hate losing. I'm a competitor. So that's a healthy feeling. But now, what do I do with that feeling in my mind? I got to switch that around. I become your fan. I study you. I get fascinated with how you did it. And, it's just a stupid little game. But now at the end, we're happy for somebody that got the chance to win. And we just messed with the circuits in our brain. And there's so many takeaways that we can have from that in the way that we got to feel. It reduces cortisol. It takes stress down. It increases serotonin, the feeling of value, belonging cues, right? We're growing belonging cues. So I just Googled it before this call, and I looked at team building activities for youth sports, and I clicked videos. I mean, I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In my first page here, they all look like reasonable, reputable, above average, resources that I can watch for 3 minutes and come to practice tomorrow with something fresh. I mean, duck, duck, goose variations, like something, what time is it, Mr. Fox? And but here's the thing, and this is another call we're going to have to, I have to be willing to be vulnerable.
Yep.
I have to be willing to show up and do something uniquely different that might be a little touchy-feely, might be a little bit, rainbows and unicorns, kumbaya. You know what? Kumbaya is pretty darn effective if you look at some of the highest performers and richest cultures that exist on the planet. Just check out Daniel Coyles' book. So I hope people really, can understand or lean into the possibilities that could be left on the table by not doing some of this stuff.
I think it's so important, and I just can't thank you enough for using your experience and your expertise in this area, the studying that you've done and the learning and the growth mindset that you use to share with us these topics, because I think maybe another time we'll talk about the college culture and how damaging it is. And we're going through it. We have a daughter that's still in college, and we're seeing stuff. And my other daughter ended her college career after 2.5 years because of very damaging coaching, old ideals about how to coach and be incredibly insensitive and attacking. And it just takes the fun. It no longer becomes the reason they're there. So I appreciate your approach so much, because I think we got to humanize the things that we do again and realize that we're dealing with young people that want to belong and they want to feel accepted. And we often have a culture that doesn't do that at all. So anyway, you're the man on this. I just thank you so much for it. So one of the things, for you listeners that Jason and I do is when we end a call, we'll talk about our next conversations, because we kind of get it. It's almost like coaching. After practice, you say, I should have did this, or maybe let's do this next time. Same thing here. I think I know where you want to go, but for our next call, what do you think we should expand on to keep the listeners having strategies to expand? Maybe culture, or where that deeper culture, or what do you think?
Yeah, right now I'm split down the middle. One, I really feel like we got to get better at working on ourselves. I do a training on dealing with difficult people and tough conversations. Those two skills are very popular in the leadership space and in the corporate private world, but also anywhere for that matter. But the ultimate, at the end, the surprise is it really has more to do with with you as a person. And Brene Brown says it best: they're doing the best they can. So that difficult athlete, that difficult person, if I adopt the mindset they're doing the best they can, I am a better coach. I'm a better teacher. I'm a better neighbor. I'm a better parent. Even though they're driving me bananas, I can be a more effective version of me if I say, you know what, they are doing the best they can for reasons that are outside of what I understand. So, going back to it, I think one call could be on how do I adopt mindsets like that? How do I work on myself? What are some resources? What are some approaches I can take? Like I talk about teachable moments a lot. How do I make this into, we had an amazing fight last week. What? Fights aren't amazing. Yeah, that was amazing. What do you mean amazing? That's like a crazy thing. It's a little disruptor. Like no fights are good. I get that violence is horrible, but it was an amazing fight because there was no social media. There were no girls. It was at the end of school. These two kids were playing basketball really intensely in the gym. They were, using a lot of energy. They're very physical. And one pushed the other pushed back. The other one had some stuff going on. He took a swing. It got broken up by another student. Joel was his name. Thank you for stepping in. He broke it up. Then the adults got into it. Both boys got suspended. That was an amazing fight. It wasn't anything toxic. It was that's the stuff that sandboxes provided to you and I. That's why, old school coaching worked on us, because we had resiliency, we had coping, but I'm digressing there. But the idea of how do we evolve as in professionally develop as coaches and thought leaders in our space, I think that's a call, being vulnerable in order to implement this stuff. And then the other one is, I'd really like to outline how to run an effective culture circle and break down the elements around the rules of restorative practices. And then when somebody steals something or somebody shows up late or somebody breaks a rule, you can have that circle and drive it more toward the restorative side of things as opposed to the culture side of things. So, that could be a whole nother.
I think so. Let's do this. We need to work on ourselves, and then we become better in that culture circle. If I'm thinking this right, because for me to be effective at running it, I got to make sure that I'm managing my emotions and my approach well. So why don't we do that? Yep. And then we'll be able to backload that culture circle.
I agree completely, because the restorative justice movement has failed miserably across the country in many schools for that reason. Teachers haven't been able to become vulnerable enough, understandably so. I empathize with them. I'm not pointing fingers, and restorative practices are amazing practices, but it does end with a teacher who's not willing to get vulnerable.
I love it. You're the best, man. I appreciate you so much. Finished up school great, and the projects you've got going on, and we'll definitely connect and we'll get it again.
Always a pleasure.
All right, take care.